Good morning, Steve from Cardiff Pain and Performance. The questions come up in clinic a lot recently about whether or not we recommend here in the clinic that patients should have a flu vaccination. Short answer is if you are suffering any ongoing disease process, if you're elderly, infirm, then yes, I think on balance we would recommend a flu vaccination. But for everyone else, I think the answer to that question is a little bit more complex, and in the next 2 or 3 minutes I'll try and explain why. So we know that if we were to take all of the cells in our body and actually count them all up, we know that they would measure somewhere north of 100 trillion cells. But we know that only about 10 trillion of those is actually cells made up of ourselves. The other 90% or so of the cells that actually occur in our bodies are actually made up of other things. Things like the viruses that we've had, the bacteria in our gut, the flora, the fauna, the fungi and the parasites. So only 10% of the cells in our body actually make up us, our tendons, our ligaments, our muscles, our joints, our brain cells, our kidney cells. The rest of it, the rest of the 90% is everything else. And so we know that in modern medicine, most of the medicines, the pharmacological remedies that we get and all the research that goes into those pharmacological remedies are actually based on just 10% of our cells, not the other 90% of the cells that actually do in fact make up us. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. The second thing I would mention is that if we were going to look at our DNA, the numbers are actually a lot more striking. So within our DNA, only 1% of our DNA, again the information that encodes our ligaments, our kidney cells, our spine cells, all of these things, only 1% are actually of us. The rest of the 99% of our DNA is actually other stuff, and the other stuff again is fungi and viruses, bacteria in the main, and other parasites. And so we know that most of the modern research that has actually gone into making us healthy from a pharmacological perspective actually only targets, if it's genetic research, just 1% of our total DNA, or perhaps 10% of the available cells in our body. So what do the other 90% of our cells do, or 99% of our DNA? Well, it actually does quite a bit, and what we call this is our microbiome, and that's largely contained in our gut and other places. And the functioning of a healthy microbiome does a whole host of things, and if I can just list some of the things so we get an idea. The first and probably the most important thing that it does, in fact, is to regulate immunity. So whether we get a cold, whether we're responsive to infection, is largely related to how healthy and abundant our gut bacteria, fungus, parasites, viruses are that live in our microbiome. So our microbiome directly affects how healthy we are likely to be in terms of regulating our immunity. That's the first thing it does. The second thing it does, we're understanding increasingly, is actually to control inflammation. Now, most of the modern disease processes that we tend to suffer from are non-genetic, and they tend to be degenerative, autoimmune type disorders, and they are all largely caused by inflammation, and the gut biome has a very, very strong correlation to controlling that. The other things that our microbiome do is help us produce vitamins. It actually also manufactures serotonin and dopamine. Now, these are neurotransmitters that make us feel happy or make us feel sad, and increasing modern research over the last decade or so has actually really pointed to that a key factor in depression, or the causative factor of depression, is actually whether or not we actually have a healthy microbiome. If we don't have a healthy microbiome, we're more likely to suffer from things like depression. And one of the other things, very interestingly, that a healthy microbiome does is actually help us regulate our environment a lot better. Now, one of the more interesting studies that came out over the last couple of years from the Immune journal, and I will pop the link in the section below, actually pointed to the fact that when a underdeveloped country was administered, in that case it was a rotavirus, so inoculation, they found that it would work less well than actually in a developed country. So if you think about that for a moment, what that actually says is that a vaccination will work, and it will work very well, but only in an already developed country. In a country that is less well developed, seemingly it doesn't work quite so well. And so if you actually look at that journal and pick apart what that's actually saying, there seems to be some type of symbiotic relationship between a healthy gut bacteria and causing the vaccination to work more effectively. So we know that the bacteria and the parasites and the fungus and the viruses all work together to actually improve immunity, but you already need that landscape in order for the flu vaccine to work effectively anyway, or the rotavirus working effectively. So if you don't have a good immune system anyway, then the virus inoculant is actually not going to work in any event. And I think that's probably the most key aspect to this, that we know that inoculations work very, very well, but only if you're already doing well. If you're not doing well, then they're not going to do so much for you in any event. So what can we do with this information? Well, for my part, what we try to do is encourage a gut biome that's actually healthy. And of the 10,000 or so different gut bacteria that seem to appear in the gut, there are a couple that we know that are really, really super important in regulating our health. And that's called Lactobacillus plantarum, Lactobacillus rhamnosus, and a funny named one called Bifidobacterium longum. These three alone seem to have a profound effect on actually nurturing our gut flora and actually maintaining our gut health and our immune health very strongly. The other things that we can do is actually try to, as best as we can, eat antibiotic-free food, because we know that the more antibiotics that we've had over a lifetime adversely affects our microbiome, and by extension then reduces our immune system. We also want to try and avoid blood sugar spikes where possible, so maintenance of a lowish GI diet is optimal. And we also need to encourage fibre-rich food. These prebiotic fibres nurture the health of the gut bacteria. And the last thing that we want to do is actually try to source and find fermented foods that are teeming with health-supported bacteria. And what I'll do is I will drop all of these into our group so you can have a look at those, and I'll create a big list. So I think the question as to whether or not a healthy individual, mum or dad with a busy lifestyle that doesn't have time to take off work and doesn't want to become ill, so they're impaired and looking after their family, I think the question arises that, is it more important to look after your gut biome first and then perhaps consider an additional top-up, which is the flu vaccination? I guess that's the personal point of view, but from my point of view is that if you decide that your primary action to safeguard your health over the winter flu season is just to take the flu jab, it may not work as effectively as you imagine if you haven't taken care of your gut biome first. It's just some thoughts for you, responding to some questions that we've had in clinic recently. I hope you found that helpful. Of course, if you do have any questions, please pop them in the comments below. And if you are interested in getting all of this additional information, then I'll pop a link and you can join our free to join group, which has all that information for you. Thank you very much. Thank you.